students.
That's okay, we can pass it around. Sorry, this is a little more tedious for you than normally. And next week, it's also in another room.
A2 is over there.
Oh yeah, it's that. See, they look like the same thing to me, but it's smaller than
it's
this one.
Smaller, it's much smaller. Well, not much, but it is smaller. I'm not entirely sure why they think it's
Yeah, I don't know. So it's the microphone that we have to use.
So maybe
Are there people who are presenting also today here now who have a presentation?
Yeah.
Maybe if you could put it up.
No, I don't have.
Oh, you don't have? Okay. Otherwise, I'll ask them to do that during the break if they have something to put up. So that.
Where do you intend on standing? In general, because the lights here are quite.
Yeah, I thought like.
You should maybe ask if you can stand here or if you actually have to.
I'll just put up the handout and then go back to your presentation. No, you can stay here. Yeah. Oh.
If you wouldn't mind using this thing here. Yeah.
To use it or not to use
it? To use it.
So does that go for me also?
No, you can walk
I
around
can
with your
do it.
microphone. But it's just because, for the sound quality, apparently it poses a problem if you pass around the microphone.
Oh, okay.
And also, I think they want to get different visuals.
Okay, so this is mine, and that's for everyone else. Okay, so let's get started. I know this is a little bit weird. Just maybe for those who are watching this video, this is not our normal classroom, so I hope the dynamics of the class will stay pretty much the same as they usually are, even though we're in a different room. So what we're going to do today, the topic of today's session is climate change and migration. However, we have a presentation of an essay outline from last week's session on human rights. So we're going to start with that. So we'll have one presentation first of an essay outline. Then I'm going to cover, first of all, looking at how do climate change and migration fit together? What's the relationship between climate change and migration, and why is this an issue? And then cover some of the different legal ways to deal with this issue, looking at refugee law, looking at human rights law, and looking at environmental law. I also wanted to say a practical thing. I don't know if some of you might have noticed, but I asked some of the students from last year's class whether it would be okay to put up their essays as examples for you. And so the ones who have kindly agreed to have their essays shared with you. So you'll find that in a folder on the Moodle page under the last section. So there are 4 essays that were written for the course last year, so you get an idea of what kinds of topics were written about and how were they written, and you can see sort of different styles and different topics just to get an idea. I should note that last year the word limit was 6,000 words excluding footnotes. This year it's including footnotes. So you'll have a little bit less space to do that writing. All right, so we will pass on to our first presentation. I think you're supposed to speak in that microphone, yeah.
Where's the diaporama mode?
Sorry?
The diaporama mode. Down on the right. Down the right. Oh yeah. Oh no? Yeah. Okay. So, well, the problem I wanted to address was states' responsibility, but also transnational corporations' responsibility. And I wanted to see if it was possible to address certain issues through human rights by using extraterritorial obligations. So I came up with these questions. Are extraterritorial obligations a legal tool to strengthen climate change mitigation efforts through human rights? And so just a quick remind. So extraterritorial obligations are the extension of states' obligation under human rights to individual outside of the territory or the effective control of the state. So as an example from this idea, could we imagine like an indigenous in Indonesia that would hold responsible a foreign state for violating its right to food because he didn't prevent a corporation based on its territory to destroy forests for example, agriculture. So also just to keep in mind that I don't deny that in the human rights field, the territorial states will always have the first responsibility, but I wanted to say, to see if there was, if there could be another complementary obligation from other states. So the 2 main issues that I wanted to address was, well, we saw that with the Paris Agreement, there still isn't a reliable compliance mechanism to force states into taking action, even if they have objectives. We can't actually force them to take measures. And also the second problem was the impunity of transnational corporations, because there isn't today an international law against violations committed by transnational corporations. So all in all, I wanted to see if by using the obligation of states towards human rights, we could help contribute to help resolving those issues. So there is also a controversy on the geographical scope of human rights, as several treaties mention that states only have obligations towards those within their jurisdiction or within their territory. Actually, the ICCR, so the social, economic, and the ICCR does not clearly mention a territorial limitation to the obligations of the states. So this is also a point. And I think that today we should be heading, or we are actually heading to the admission of extraterritorial obligation, even if it's not officially recognized, because this is more and more discussed in the human rights field. There are, for example, the Maastricht principles that were made by a group of experts in human rights and that recognize the extraterritorial obligations of the states. There is also the UN Charter that recognizes international cooperation, so the obligation of the state to cooperate in order to ameliorate, to improve the situation of human rights. And also this sentence that I quite like, because I think that it has no sense in admitting the universality of human rights, but only as rights, but not as obligations. And so my main argument is that extraterritorial obligation actually exists to a certain degree, that states must recognize that they have a responsibility toward human rights, toward other individuals, not only the individuals in their territory, and also because of the duty to respect, protect, and fulfill, and also because of the obligation to assist and cooperate that we've seen 2 weeks ago. And that extraterritorial obligations are actually a means to pressure states into taking measures against human rights violations and also climate change, because they're both related, as you know, probably that transnational corporations not only violate human rights but also the environment. But there are several difficulties to this. First of all, that there is no precedent, there is no jurisprudence about this. It's not official, and also that we could argue that there may be other approaches that are maybe more easy, that are probably easier. And this is a few points that I want to address in my essay. So the link between climate change and human rights, to make things clear, the existence of extraterritorial obligations, also the obligation of states under human rights law, address the problematic of transnational corporations and how there isn't yet a system that's an international system to punish them. The link and effectiveness of extraterritorial obligation with the mitigation efforts, which will be probably the most difficult to make because it's kind of a long shot. It's like a second effect, because with wider protection of human rights, we could achieve also a wider protection of the environment and the advantages and obstacles to this hypothesis. So that's it. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that presentation, and I apologize that you had to wait an extra week to do it, but you do get this lovely platform to
Yeah.
give your presentation. So just as a reminder for all of you, I do hope that you will discuss with each other the progress that you're making on your essays and your ideas. And if you have any questions that you want to ask, please do make use of our office hours, preferably before the week before the final deadline. So do make use of that. I am going to try to retrieve my handout now. Yep. So moving on to today's topic of climate change and migration. So to start off with, why is this an issue? Why are we talking about migration in the context of climate change? You might have to speak a bit loudly so that we can hear you. Yeah.
Because of causes and climate change will result in states, people are going to need to displace themselves to in their own country or even out the borders.
Yeah, good. So because of the impacts of climate change, people will be forced to move from where they're living, whether it's within their own country or across the borders of the state where they're living. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the first assessment report, which was published in 1990, predicted that migration would be the single biggest threat of climate change. So people having to move from where they're living would be the single biggest threat resulting from climate change. Now, the numbers predicting how many people will have to migrate because of climate change vary quite widely. So they're anywhere between 25 million and 1 billion, which obviously is a huge is a huge spread of numbers. Why do you think that these figures are so different? Yeah?
Well, I read the last assessment in 2014, and they say that most of these forecasts about climate migration have a medium level of certainty because there are other reasons why they migrate besides climate change.
Yeah.
So it's not like a one cause factor. Yeah, a phenomenon because it's a
Yeah. Yeah, very good. So it's very difficult to say people migrate only because of one thing. There's only one cause for this migration, and that cause relates directly to climate change. So it's difficult to say how many people are actually migrating directly because of climate change impacts, or because of other impacts. And of course, most of the time it's because of a variety of things. Yeah?
Yeah, no, you just mentioned it. I mean, I just wanted to point out that people don't migrate because of climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, they migrate because of droughts and all those kind of things that are, I mean, you cannot know when that is actually an effect of climate change or when it will be there even without climate change.
Exactly, yeah. So it's difficult to tell. I mean, I think this is a good point that you're making. People are not migrating because of climate change, but because, for example, they can't grow their crops anymore because of droughts, or because their land is flooded and they can't physically live there anymore. So they're more indirect impacts. Yeah?
One of the other reasons why there might be such a huge variety in the estimates is because just in terms of forecasts, in terms of climate change, are so different as well. So depending on what sort of estimates or what the impact people are thinking that climate change is going to have, will have a direct impact on the future forecasts of migration.
Yeah, exactly. So in addition to, so the previous responses sort of already took for granted that there would be impacts from climate change, but not knowing how to directly relate these impacts to migration. But of course, there's also an issue, a more fundamental issue of disagreement on what exactly climate change is going to cause. So there's pretty much consensus about the fact that climate change is happening, but exactly what it's going to do is not clear. And if you don't know how much temperatures are going to vary, or whether a drought is caused by climate change, or whether whether it's sort of a normal phenomenon that's outside of the climate change with big C's, that's also a good question to ask. There are different, so there are distinctions that you can make, and that one of them has already been mentioned, between internal displacement and displacement across borders. So even though the topic of climate change migration, and specifically the term climate refugees, is very sort of popular, talking about climate refugees, and we'll get to that when I talk about refugee law, that refers only to those people who cross the border of their own country. Even though the biggest number of people, by far the biggest number of people, and even outside of the context of climate change, migration is mostly a problem internally. So most people who migrate don't migrate across the borders of their countries, but stay within the borders. And there are different legal regimes that apply when people cross the border of their country or when people stay within their own borders. So that's one important distinction to make. Another distinction is whether people are displaced voluntarily or whether they're forced to leave. So of course, not everybody who migrates is necessarily forced to migrate, right? There are people who leave who might not physically be forced to migrate. So there are distinctions to be made. There are people moving because they seek a better life somewhere else, even though they might not be forced, or are people moving, for instance, because their land doesn't exist anymore, because it's been flooded, so they don't have a choice except to move. And then there's also a distinction to be made between temporary displacement and permanent displacement. So if people are leaving areas of conflict, for example, that might be temporary displacement, considering that a lot of people might like to come back after the conflict is over. When we talk about climate change, in some cases, it might not be possible for people to come back. So if you look at small island developing states, if the land actually disappears, there's nowhere to go back to. So that would have to be a more permanent form of migration rather than a temporary migration. So these are points to keep in mind. And so the question that we have to address, not necessarily find an answer to, but at least think about this question, is how do we deal with migration that's caused, at least in part, by climate change? And how do we deal with that in terms of law? So the classification of these migrants is one of the big issues. How do we classify these people? And I'm sure that you've heard a lot of different terms used when we talk about migration. And I'm also fairly certain that you'll understand that there are differences and probably even know the differences between those. So when you read the news and you talk about migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, they're not necessarily the same thing in legal terms. So they're distinct categories. Are there any questions about this? Yeah?
I have a comment.
Yeah? Comments are fine too, yeah.
It's about this voluntary / forced distinction, which I really don't feel comfortable with in terms of like climate refugees, because if I'm like voluntarily leaving, okay, I cannot harvest anymore. I can harvest like a smaller portion of my field or whatever because of droughts, right? Because of global warming. So I leave voluntarily when I'm really hungry, but then I'm forced when I'm about to starve, right? I mean, at what point does my field have to be completely unproductive for me to be classified under forced or voluntary?
Yeah. It's an excellent question, and it's not a question that I can answer definitively. So you're absolutely right that, as very often happens, there are different categories, but it's very difficult to actually articulate what falls into which category. So I would say that it's easier to define the very clear cases, so extreme cases on one end or the other. So voluntary migration, I'm not living in my country of origin, so I'm a migrant. right? And many of you, I guess, I don't know if anybody is Swiss. Is anybody Swiss in this class? Oh, we've got one Swiss. We're all migrants, and this would be voluntary. At least I'm assuming. I don't know. So you go somewhere else to work, to live, to study. So that's clear. And I think the cases of forced migration in very extreme circumstances, so when people are driven off their land because of conflict, those are clear too, but everything else in between, and I would tend to agree with you that everything relating to climate change, if you talk about climate change and migration, it's very unclear when it would be forced and when it would be voluntary. Yeah.
So if I had to come up with a definition of climate migrant, I would not necessarily put that distinction in. I mean, that was pretty much to answer to the question.
Yeah.
I'll just keep that part.
Yeah, so this is one we're talking about. So I think, okay, this is a good bridge then to move to legal categories and to look at refugee law. Because voluntary versus forced migration, you're assuming that there's still a choice. So with migration, there might be a choice. Now, when we talk about refugee law, is that too high or is it okay? So there are different legal categories that we can look at to try to place, I'll use the term migrants as sort of a broad category to define all climate migrants. So when you talk about refugees, if you say climate refugees, what would that mean legally? Sorry? Nothing. Okay. So why? Why is it nothing?
Because there's a very strict and very narrow definition of what is refugee under the 1951 Refugee Convention.
Yeah.
And that's precisely what scholars have been trying to do since these problems of climate refugees just came up. Trying to afford the legal regime inside the refugee conventions is like the most broad. Even they can work abroad, but in the end, it's really, really narrow. Just, there's the definition, and climate change cannot be associated as persecuting someone. So.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah.
And they were excluded also from the convention, not only not mentioned, they weren't classified at all as refugees, and they were also excluded because the convention says that the victims of natural disasters, for example, are not considered as refugees, and people who are changing or migrating within the country are not refugees. And in most cases, climate refugees move within one country and not across borders. So there's like an exclusion for them.
Okay, good. So you're already answering a lot of my questions here, yeah?
I wouldn't say exclude, because since we checked the date, it's in 1951, and by that time climate change was not really a threat as it is now. And it was more to apply this convention to all the persons after the Second World War. So maybe it's not that they wanted to exclude this kind of people, but there was not this problem. So they're trying now to protect them in the existing legal regimes, but not in the refugee convention. That's also what it means.
Okay, very good. So let me just sort of recap what you said. So when I asked what is climate refugees, you said nothing, because there's a very strict legal definition under international law of what a refugee is, and that doesn't relate to climate or climate change or environment. And so you said that climate refugees, quote unquote, are excluded from this definition. And I think in a way you're both correct, because yes, they are excluded, but no, not sort of intentionally, because the Refugee Convention was drafted in 1951, which was a clear post-Second World War construction. And so the definition of what a refugee is was very much in that context. And there is no other international legal agreement defining what what a refugee is. So there are regional agreements, which we'll also look at. But this, if we talk about international refugee law, this is the definition of what a refugee is. So when I did my master's, I did a course on international refugee law, and it was basically 20 weeks of looking at this definition and going through case law, looking at these different categories and how this was judged in different cases. So there's really a lot more. We're covering this topic very briefly, but there's really a lot more that you could do with this. So the definition of a refugee, according to the 1951 Refugee Convention, is somebody who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality, and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Or somebody who is already outside of his or her country and is unable or unwilling to go back because of that fear. So so let's sort of look at this definition and then answer the question, why is it so difficult to classify climate refugees as a refugee under international law? Yeah.
Because each element of the definition is distinct. So, and what I mean by that is that the first element, the well-founded fear of being persecuted, it cannot have a cause and effect relationship with the second element, which means that your social group cannot just be the fact that we were all persecuted in the same way. That persecution has to have an external factor, which is one of the 5 things that are listed out, which is the largest problem with climate change-induced migration, that it won't necessarily impact people of one race, religion, nationality, etc., etc. Although there's a slight possibility that governments may discriminate in how they apply, let's say, adaptation or mitigation policies. That's the only scenario where you could possibly argue that climate change-induced migration leads to people being refugees.
Yeah, good. So you're looking at these different categories. So a refugee has to fit within one of these categories. So race, religion, nationality, a member of a particular social group or political opinion. And when you look at people who have to migrate because of, at least in part because of the impacts of climate change, there is no discrimination between people of these different groups. So it's not that people of a certain race or a certain social group or certain political opinion or religion will be affected more than others, arguably. So that's one thing that these categories don't fit. Yeah.
My thinking is that compared to the definition of under the Refugee Convention, climate change could impact everybody.
Yeah.
Not focusing on certain groups or certain races. Even though there are some extent that some people could can be influenced by the climate change the most, but some people not. But there are some differences, but everybody can be influenced by the climate change. That's why it's very hard to define.
Yeah, good. So climate change doesn't have an impact specifically on specific groups of people, but indiscriminately has an impact on everybody, even though some groups and regions and peoples will be more vulnerable to those impacts than others. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to raise that issue that, like, if you belong to a social group or a specific race, then you're obviously going to be a lot more vulnerable to climate change. So I think that it's a bit wrong, like, especially in the research handbook, they're always like emphasizing how climate change doesn't differentiate, but the effects of climate change do differentiate based on these lines. And also, like, for the fear of being persecuted, one of the cases that they mentioned here as to how this can be actually employed is like state action that might lead to further environmental degradation, but also state actions that protect or further increment climate change are often not targeted or harm a specific social group. So for example, a state might adopt policies that, for example, a landfill, and those landfills are often placed based on racial lines or social lines, think it does differentiate particularly.
Yeah, so this is a good point also. So you're sort of pushing back against this idea that you can't apply the Refugee Convention to climate refugees because these categories don't exist. But saying, I think correctly, that the impacts of climate change don't affect people indiscriminately. And there are clear groups of people who are more vulnerable. So it might be some of these categories will probably be more relevant than others. So maybe social groups, race, I don't know, religion, maybe nationality. It would be difficult considering how these groups are defined in the law, which of course we don't have time to cover completely, but I think you do have a good point in saying that it's too easy to just say, well, these categories don't apply because some people are clearly more vulnerable than others. But there is a problem with, so let's imagine that you could define climate refugees into these categories, or into some of these categories, or one of these categories at least. What might be another problem?
Yeah, also a precondition in order to be defined as refugees to be outside of the country and also to be unable and unwilling to go back. And most of the time it is argued that there are certain areas within the country which are still like safe or where still people can return to, for example, capitals, and then these people will lose the protection status outside.
Yeah, so another point is that people have to be, well, they don't yet have to be outside of their country, but they have to want to go outside of their own country. And then what about who a refugee is asking protection from? Or you wanted to say something else? Go ahead.
So this definition lets you think that your own government persecuted you, and as a climate refugee, maybe well, you think it doesn't fit. It's not that your government or you have not been persecuted by someone, like climate, so it doesn't fit.
Yeah, so this is a very good point. So it's not just that somebody who's a refugee has to be persecuted, but the persecution has to be, so it either has to be the own government who is persecuting, or at least it has to be the government who's not able to protect this person from the persecution. And so this is an issue when you talk about climate refugees. Yeah?
I also think that when looking outside of, governments, if you add climate refugees into that, there might be an issue with international organizations that have specific mandates to protect refugees that have left because of conflict, and where would that fall into, like, who would take care of these particular refugees? Would it be IOM? Would it be UNHCR? Would it be, it could get quite complicated when realizing certain mandates, and would it be NGOs that deal with it, or it's much broader than governments.
So this is a sort of criticism or a concern, at least that's raised quite frequently. It sort of goes outside of just the strictly the definition of what a refugee is, but some people would argue it's not very desirable to try to fit climate refugees or maybe environmental refugees or migrants or whatever term you apply to that into this definition, because then it would become applicable to so many people that how do you deal with this huge variety of refugees, putting them all into one definition. So that's a concern that's raised quite often. Yeah?
I think another thing is that climate change is kind of like a hidden thing that drives all these persecutions of certain race people or group of ethnic people. Like the government would like, we lost land here, I'm gonna push these people out to do other developments or things like that. So it's not a clear cut of what, like, you cannot pinpoint that climate change to this, but you can easier to pinpoint that this group of people was displaced or become refugee because they was persecuted by government or groups or whatever actors there is, and it's just harder for you people to
Yeah.
the guy.
I mean, that's so this definition was written in a certain context, and it's obvious how you can apply this definition to a certain group of refugees, and it's much more difficult to imagine doing that for climate refugees. And I wanted to go back to a point which I think sort of relates to what you were saying, in terms of so this is something that Soumya said at the in one of the first comments, that you could imagine how you could apply this definition in the context of climate change if, for example, let's say a government takes mitigation strategies. So, I don't know, for example, cuts down forests to grow biofuels or to grow certain crops as a strategy to mitigate climate change. To say, okay, we need to use less fossil fuels. We're going to grow biofuels. That could be part of a mitigation strategy to climate change, but that then might discriminate, or it might be seen, for example, as persecution of people who were living on the land in the forests, let's say. But then you could say, you might be able to imagine how that would fit within the refugee definition, but that would, in a way, no longer be related directly to the impacts of climate change, but to actions that that governments or non-governmental actors are taking. So there are ways that you could imagine this to work, but the general idea is that it would be very difficult to apply this definition of refugee to climate refugees. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on this, I think the big problem is the word persecution, because that actually means like systematic oppression, right?
Yeah.
That is human on human. Like there's, in the word persecution itself, there's no space, I feel, at least for anything that is not a person against another person, kind of. And in climate change, of course, this is a bit different.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I mean, it's this, the persecution is really a big issue. You have to be persecuted. How can you say that you're persecuted if you can't say exactly who is doing the wrong? And these are things that we have looked at in previous classes. It's very difficult to, I mean, this goes for human rights law also, that we looked at how do you say which impact is caused by which action, and how can you call that persecution? Does it have to be intentional, or can it be indirect and not necessarily intentional? So those are big questions. If you're interested in refugee law, you'll be able to find a lot more details on how all these different categories, how persecution is defined, how each of these different groups are defined. So you'd really have to read more case law on refugee law to figure out how these categories are defined. So in addition to the Refugee Convention, there are also some regional conventions that apply broader definitions of refugee. So the two that I've put up here are the convention by the Organization of African Unity and the Cartagena Convention. So you have the two regional conventions, not international conventions, that have a wider definition of refugee. So it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't include persecution, doesn't include the word persecution, doesn't include these different categories, so these different groups. So in the Organization of African Unity Convention, it can be any person owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order. So how could you imagine climate refugees possibly fitting into this definition? Yeah?
I mean, I think you could see them fitting in under events seriously disturbing public order,
Yeah.
especially if you think about like islands that are literally the land just disappearing. I think the problem would be maybe the problem in other particular areas where if it's something that's less extreme, like just a drought that's not, that's causing them to be able to like plant less crops or something else, it might be harder to say it's seriously disturbing public order.
Yeah.
It also is maybe unclear if it has to be the public order of the
So
Yeah.
if it has to be the whole country being addressed to qualify, then that would be probably a problem.
Yeah, so this definition actually includes public order either in part or in the whole of his or her country. So that would cover that issue. But I would completely agree with you that it's that not every event that or not every situation or context that would cause people to migrate or to leave their place of residence is necessarily a serious disturbance of public order. That's sort of a big thing, whereas often reasons why people would leave are more not sort of big bang events, but more gradual things. So it might be more difficult to define that as a serious disturbance of public order, but there is a bit more scope here. Yeah?
I think it's harder to get that or climate refugees to fit into the implementation of that definition rather than like just the definition itself. You'd imagine, civil disorder that would come from, massive environmental catastrophe that would happen from climate change, but you can't really imagine any sort of, because this is more like soft law mechanisms in other countries in the region helping each other out. Whereas if this is widespread, everybody would be dealing with their own issues and not really forced to helping or forced into helping at all. So
Yeah, good. So you're making a really good distinction between, theoretically, if we could imagine that you could theoretically fit climate refugees within this definition, or whether in practice this would you would actually be able to use this convention to get refugee status.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it's not only when we're discussing this topic, but really a lot of the topics that we discuss. There's of course distinctions between what we discuss theoretically, or maybe sort of the ambitions or the ideals, and in practice it might not be quite as easy to do that. Yep.
I was just going to say that, like, framing the discussion in terms of environmental refugees or climate refugees and just having like the vast amount of numbers of climate refugees, it also makes government frame the issue as a national security issue often. So I'm not sure if framing it as climate refugees is the right way to go if you want to make more progressive like policies in order to like address all the massive migration, because it's often framed as like, okay, so we're going to have all these climate refugees coming into our countries, it's a national security issue.
Yeah.
So let's tighten up our like refugee policy, our national refugee policies.
Yeah.
And that's what's been happening like in Canada, for example, in the past 10 years. Just like refugee policies have just closed doors and doors and doors.
Yeah, and this is sort of a good point, looking at the broader context of migration. So not only looking at environment or climate, but that the framing of this issue, which I think is really important to for whatever we're discussing or for whatever you are discussing in other classes, also to think about how issues are framed, because it's very important. We discuss problems in the context of how we identify what the problems are, and there are always bigger contexts. So in a lot of discussions about migration, including those related to climate change and environment more broadly, there's been a lot of focus on security, which would take away the focus from the human, the human beings that are actually in need of protection. So it's about vast numbers of people. If you have the higher the higher estimate would be 1 billion people. I mean, that's obviously a huge number. So then it's no longer seen as a humanitarian issue where individuals are in need of protection, but a security issue. And so many people are moving. How are we going to deal with that in terms of national security? Yep.
Going back to how the climate refugees could be fit into these both these definitions. I know it's not related, but just playing with words, I'm seeing that external aggression, like it's stated nowhere that it has to be like military aggression or a state aggression. Where, like in the Cartagena Declaration, it says foreign aggression, so this kind of reminds of state and such.
Yeah.
To work like certain states are being attacked, so aggression by pollution, global warming, and such. So that could actually make some sense.
Yeah.
Stretch it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good exercise thing to really look at what the words say, because this is what this is what lawyers do when they look at cases. They say, okay, external aggression. I mean, I'm not familiar with the case law based on these conventions, so I don't know how these definitions exactly have worked out, but I think it's a good point in saying it doesn't say it has to be military aggression, or it doesn't necessarily say it has to be foreign aggression, so it could be external to a group, maybe. So there are a lot of ways you could interpret this. Okay, I'm going to move on to other areas of international law, because it is my aim today to, one, give you a proper break, unlike last time, and two, give you enough time for the presentations at the end, which is, to be honest, a lot easier when I'm standing up here than in the other room, so this might be a good thing. So we looked at refugee law very quickly and noted that there are difficulties in fitting people who move because of climate change impacts, or in part because of climate change impacts, under refugee law. Even though it's not impossible, some people would say that it is possible to fit climate refugees within that definition, but it would be very difficult. So some other areas of law have been sort of brought to the fore as alternatives to refugee law. So to put it simply, if you can't protect these people using refugee law, what other ways are there to make sure that there's some kind of protection for people who have to leave because of a change in climate? So one of these areas is human rights law, which we looked at, which we have looked at already last week. So human rights law is considered a lex specialis of public international law, and then refugee law is considered a lex specialis of human rights law. So you have public international law, which is sort of the broad category, and then you have human rights law, which focuses on a specific area of public international law, and refugee law then focuses on a specific area of human rights law. So it protects human rights, but only in a very clearly identified category. So if you can't use refugee law to get protection, then some people say then you can use human rights law, or at least try to use human rights law. So there are many rights that could possibly be put forth. So the right to life, the right to food, the right to health, the right to a healthy environment, or the right to housing. So there are a lot of, I mean, arguably the whole range of human rights could be put forth depending on what the situation is. Another term or concept that's often used in refugee law or migration law is the term non-refoulement. Does anybody know what that means? Yeah?
Means you cannot return a person if the person, in the case you would return it, could be potentially, his life could be potentially in threat. I mean, it would be subjected to, I don't know, torture, or his life would be in danger.
Yeah. So basically it means that states are not allowed to return somebody.
His life is in danger.
Yeah, if somebody's life is in danger, so you can't just send somebody back to their country. Good, yeah?
It's not only their life, it's also their freedom, actually.
Yeah?
Quite a big part of it.
Did I see, yeah?
But does that add something to refugee law? Because isn't being a refugee a precondition for the non-refoulement?
Well, it's not, also it doesn't only apply in refugee law. So the non-refoulement is included in the Refugee Convention, but it's also included in human rights law. For example, the Convention Against Torture. So one argument would be that if you can't apply refugee law, if that doesn't apply, you could still apply non-refoulement, or you could still invoke that under human rights law. So say, okay, somebody, you can't categorize somebody as a refugee, but you still can't send them back under these and these human rights conventions. Yeah.
And I think an example for this is the European Temporary Protection Directive,
Yeah.
which bases itself on Article 2 and Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and says like you can't send people back if they face threats to their life, threats being subjected to torture, and actually climate refugees could fall under this Temporary Protection Directive within EU law.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So, what are some of the maybe drawbacks of this principle when you look at climate refugees? Yeah?
I mean, you're splitting an issue that is a very specific issue into what you're doing is you're saying, all right, people are migrating because they're facing difficulties. Instead of looking at migration as the entire problem, we're going to look at whether they get food as a separate problem, water as a separate issue, good governance is a third issue, etc., etc., etc. So the point becomes that instead of focusing on their situation and instead of trying to figure out a holistic solution to the situation, you start treating the symptoms.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that would be if you look at, if you maybe you take specific human rights.
Right.
Yeah, so you could, I mean, I think it's a good point. I think it's a good point if you're questioning, I mean, you could question the whole legal framework rather than trying to find solutions within a framework that's not working to really address the...
Sorry, my point isn't that. My point is about political capital, in as much as it's not that states in international law have unlimited political capital, right? And you can't, it's difficult to agree to amend a refugee convention, difficult to agree to create a new convention, or even a temporary set of guiding principles in this regard. My point is that if instead of focusing on any of these things that offer a more holistic solution, you start focusing on this, then states will say, this is it, this is our responsibility done, we have nothing more to do with this.
Okay, so you say if we try to sort of squeeze climate refugees under existing human rights law or principle of non-refoulement, then that will give off a signal that we can deal with this problem through these categories, and we don't necessarily have to come up with a more specific solution to this specific problem. Yeah, I think that's a good point. But I think also a lot of people would argue that while waiting for a better solution, then these are the options that are available maybe to people now. So they could use this concept of non-refoulement. Another concept which you could give a whole course on, and we're going to discuss it in maybe 1 minute now, is this idea of responsibility to protect. Does anybody know what that means or where that came from? I did put sort of links to these concepts on the handout, so you can, click on that and read more about it after the class if you're interested. Yeah?
Responsibility to protect, as far as I know it, is a justification for violating, for intervening in another state's affairs because of a compelling enough reason, and in most cases, how R2P has been painted is in terms of gross human rights violations. So the philosophical justification comes from states have a interest in seeing that no state grossly violates human rights, because that sort of weakens the entire system of sovereignty and states having control over what can happen and cannot happen, and so that's why this was adopted.
Yeah, good. And it's very so the idea is in international law there are specific criteria for one state to be allowed to intervene in the affairs of another state. And this is sort of an addition to the existing legal framework, this idea of responsibility to protect, sort of if a whole population or if a group of people is suffering from serious human rights violations, there should be a way for other states to intervene without needing to go through the existing, without getting sort of permission from the UN Security Council, or without the states asking other states to come in or asking another state to come in. But it's very controversial. I think it was for a while at least very much a thing. You will see that in international law, and I'm sure in other disciplines also, you kind of have concepts and topics that become very popular and that are discussed a lot. So it's called R2P, responsibility to protect. Similar with the discussions on fragmentation of international law. So they get a lot of attention and then kind of fade a little bit more into the background. So this concept has been invoked mostly to intervene in contexts of conflicts where there are serious human rights violations. So some would argue that responsibility to protect could be used also to offer protection to climate migrants or climate refugees. And one of the, so what might be an advantage of this concept? I mean, what I should say before asking this question also is that it's often seen more as a political commitment, the responsibility to protect, than a legal commitment. So you will have people who argue that this is a legal, that responsibility to protect is a legal commitment, but it's not at all clear that it is. So what might be an advantage of the responsibility to protect as compared to the non-refoulement principle? Yeah?
Accountability, holding a state that is failing in its obligation to protect particular migrants, for example. So another state could intervene in that situation and hold the violating state accountable to the failures.
Okay, so you say that responsibility to protect would be more of a signal of the state failing to
Take adequate action.
yeah, but the state where these migrants are coming from or are located in, more so than the non-refoulement principle. Okay, that could be one. Yeah. Well, you can.
I guess the responsibility to protect entails like taking action, while the non-refoulement is already when a person is considered a refugee, whereas the responsibility to protect it requires the state to, see a crisis and act.
Yeah. Okay, so responsibility to protect is more active than just saying, okay, these people have left and you can't send them back, but then responsibility to protect might be protecting people before they have already left. Okay, yeah.
I guess like extraterritorial obligations, so because it applies mainly outside of state's territory than
Yeah.
within the borders.
Yeah.
Along the lines of this directive.
Yeah. So it's not only obligations for people who are already in the borders of your own country, but also responsibility for people who are somewhere else in another state. What about, I mean, I'm thinking of, if you look at the principle of non-refoulement, what is that assuming?
It assumes that people are already, in your territory. But because the only way you can't send them back is, it assumes that you're willing to take them in even if they're not in. So you're dealing with the second bridge of that question, which is, do you send them back?
Yeah, yeah, and I think this was already sort of said implicitly. So non-refoulement is assuming that people have already left, when we did see at the beginning of class that most people don't actually leave their own country. By far, the biggest majority stay within the borders of their own country. And another thing, so responsibility to protect would be more protecting people who haven't left their country, so it would apply to a lot more people, yeah?
It's interesting to see, responsibility to protect sounds so nice because it places responsibility on those that can't do what they can. But it really doesn't work that way. The responsibility isn't like if I am someone who's suffering from gross human rights violations, I say, oh, well, Western liberal democracies, please exercise your responsibility and protect me. It's the other way around. So R2P was used to partially rightly take down the Milosevic regime in Serbia. And then eventually you come to Afghanistan, Iraq, what have you. My point is that it's more of a privilege. It's not an obligation. And that's why the distinction between political and legal obligations becomes important, because this is not a legal obligation, so you only do it when you want to do it, as opposed to being told you have a duty to do it.
So this could be sort of answering the opposite of the question asked, which is a very good point, saying that whereas non-refoulement would be a legal obligation because it is included in legal text, the responsibility to protect it's a political obligation, and in reality, when it has been invoked, it's been invoked because the state who is taking the responsibility to protect has some has some benefits in doing that. So if you're sort of a bit more cynical, maybe than the average, international lawyer, you would say this is the responsibility to protect is not actually about protecting people. It's about political advantages of whichever state is doing the protecting.
So just for instance, I mean, the last week after there was lots of, for about a few months, there have been lots of criticism labeled at Australia for the detention centers in Nauru. None of those people are still going to Australia. They're being taken in by the US, and this is being sold by the Australian government as sort of, oh, well, look, we're sending them somewhere. But, I mean, again, the idea then becomes that you kept them in horrible conditions for so long, and now you can just pawn them off. That seems to me to be where the debate is currently at, that states have more of a say in dictating policy based on extraneous concerns, and no one's really looking at the actual, well, why we should do this, as opposed to, well, oh, well, states can do it. And that I think is a kind of problem with R2P as well.
But this is when you see really clearly the distinction between sort of legal obligations and political obligations, and it's important. And I think it's not so easy to distinguish between the two. So you don't have, I don't think you have legal obligations that are apolitical. So it's a good point to think about, but it probably, I think we could spend a lot of time discussing this point. So what I wanted to do is also to just to touch on another area of law, which is environmental law, which is also sometimes presented as a way to deal with climate refugees or climate migrants that's outside of refugee law. So two of the main principles that could be used that are under environmental law are responsibility for transboundary environmental harm, which is the do no harm principle. So the obligation not to cause environmental harm outside of the boundary of your own state. And then the second one, which is a polluter pays principle, which we have looked at in the context of climate justice already. So some people would argue that one way you could try to find a way to protect people who have to migrate because of climate change impacts is through environmental law. So you don't actually have to go through refugee law or human rights law, but you can look at existing environmental law and try to offer some form of protection, and also to attribute accountability for the climate change impacts through environmental law. So just briefly to cover some of these different areas of law. I've put here a link which I think is interesting for you to look at. We won't do it in class, but some commentary on what the Paris Agreement says about migration. So it does include the word migrants in the agreement, which is already, as we also saw with human rights, really can be a big thing, just the terms that are included in a legal text and what that might mean for the progression of attention given to this topic. So you can have a look at that. The last thing that I will do, and we're not going to discuss these questions in class, but what I did, I just wanted to point out these different ways. So in one of the readings that I gave you, the author presents 3 ways in which climate refugees could be classified, or in which this issue could be addressed under law. So the question that I asked at the beginning of class, what do we do with people who have to migrate in part because of climate change impacts, and how do we How do we classify them under international law? So the first suggestion that he gives is revising the 1951 Refugee Convention. So revising that convention so that environmental refugees and climate refugees can fit within that. The second is drafting a new convention for climate refugees. So a completely new convention that would specifically address issues relating to climate refugees and not all refugees, which would address the concern that you mentioned. If you put climate refugees under the existing refugee convention, you might end up, or you will end up with a gigantic group of refugees that are very diverse. And a third is using a combination of existing legal principles to fill in the gaps. And this is actually what we've looked at just now. So using human rights law, using environmental law, using also regional agreements, so not only international law, but regional agreements that might have broader definitions of refugees. So rather than coming up with something new, using what's already there to fill in these gaps. So what I had wanted to ask you is which one of these options you'd think is most effective. So we might start off class next week just discussing these questions for the first 10 minutes, because I am actually very curious to hear what you think about this. So for next week's class, we're going to start briefly with this discussion. And what I'd like to do now is give you a break. We have 5 presentations of essay outlines after the break. For those who are presenting, please try to stick to your time so that we can finish on time. And if you do have a presentation, a PowerPoint or another presentation that you want to put up, then please do that during the break. So we start at 3:30. Oh, you've already looked.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
fine. Yeah. Yeah, that's well. So
If it's a
you'll go.
huge
No,
agreement,
it's
I
not.
can
It's
try
not
and-
at all. No, no, no.
Okay.
It's not a problem at all. So on the 1st of December.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Thank you so much.
So I'll move you. So
Like that?
down here.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Liz, did you have a USB in here, or somebody else?
There are 3.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of USBs in here.
And then I just click like this.
Yeah, you can open that.
Can I just test?
Yeah.
Or okay.
Yeah, there are 3 USBs in there.
Can I?
Yeah, I don't know.
There are 4 actually. Like
Which one? Sorry, which one is your USB stick? Mine is this. I was the one who was called that. This one. I was and this one is not. No.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't. Sorry for
No, I'm sorry for
No, no, it's okay.
the trouble. I just wanted to clarify. I think it's not that the extension for the number of students will not include city hall students. I think that is okay. I think the rule allows city hall students. That's what you told me.
But I don't think it's not a problem
But I think you can actually get the link.
Oh, it's online. I saw that.
Oh, you already have.
Because I have friends who got their class done yesterday, and they wanted to see whether or not it was just live or
Yeah.
if you'd be able to access it later, and you can access it.
Well, I asked especially because some groups are
Yeah, he passes watching because he said. So I'm putting it first.
So let's hope that one.
Yeah, we want to do it. Yeah. Although I think I'm really curious to know how many people actually
Yeah,
watch them.
yeah, they probably
No?
probably count some people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I think it is a really good.
I'm sure, especially for people
Because
who
you have
are
no idea how things. I mean, I guess class doesn't run very short, which is why it's really good for the range.
I was interested in this class too, because I've had very different feedback from people.
Which nothing.
It's multiple times, and I'm not really. Or different people, some friends want to understand it. Some really love it, and others don't like
Well,
it.
I think it's based on sort of the it's just based on like
Okay, yeah, like the big topics that people would be interested in. That makes sense.
or maybe something like to then at least you get a range of.
Yeah.
Oh, you're first.
Yes. They would talk about everything that I'm about to say.
No, but that's fun. I'm sure it's good to sometimes. I think sometimes people are, and then you can just talk about one thing. Yeah, and especially when good class.
How's it going? What? Good. Very good. Very good.
Everything is going to
Yeah.
create your hand out.
You never know.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. But the first time around, cool. You guys. Talk about that. Yes.
So it's
But
but then I think
no. I just saw you writing Kendra. Good luck with
so
that. Writing Kendra. Oh.
so maybe I'll take this.
No, just asking you about that. So I'm going to Boulder on Monday. So we can, like, hey, could you write me a letter saying that I am doing good and please I'll be right next to you.
Okay, so if everybody can take a seat again.
Then we will start with our first presentation. So there'll be 3 presentations that relate quite directly to the topic that we discussed today, to climate change and migration, and one presentation that will be a little bit different, but no less interesting. So Camille, you're up, and you have 5 minutes.
So, as we've seen, one of the effects of climate change has been the rising sea levels, which has posed a great threat to the physical disappearance of low-lying islands, such as Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Maldives. And the inhabitants of these islands will probably lose their territory, even though we don't really know when that's going to happen, having an impact on the sovereignty of their country and also having repercussions on human rights, such as the right to property, education, and as we've discussed last week in class, the right to health and the right to food. So where are these inhabitants supposed to migrate to? And how will they be represented, considering the international law framework is centered around states? But what I was the most interested in is to what extent do states have the obligation under international law to help and support the people of these disappearing low islands. So a little bit of background. Why am I interested in this topic? So I lived in Sri Lanka, and it's very close to the Maldives, and I've also been there. And I have quite a bit of Maldivian friends who have moved to Sri Lanka, mostly for political reasons, but that's a different story. And it's actually been a recurring joke among my friends as to what would happen to them when the Maldives will disappear, and they say, oh, it's fine, we're just going to move to Sri Lanka, it's all cool. But I was actually really interested to see, for these other people who don't have the possibility to just go to Sri Lanka, what would happen to them, and is there an actual solution to it? So, in my paper, I chose not to use the word environmental refugees or climate refugees as we've discussed in class, because I personally think that it has quite a bit of baggage attached to the word refugees, and on top of that, it has a very precise legal definition as we've seen under the 1951 Refugee Convention, especially with the word persecution and everything, just as we've discussed in class. So I will instead use the word environmental displacees, which was in one of the readings that we had to do today, and the definition being people who are forced to leave their usual place of residence because their lives, livelihoods, and welfare have been placed at serious risk as a result of adverse environmental processes and events. And in this paper, obviously, inhabitants having to leave their physical territory because their home is sinking is obviously forced to leave their usual place of residence. So my main argument will revolve around the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 2.1, stating the following. Each state party to the present covenant undertakes the steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant by all appropriate means, including particularly the adoption of legislative measures. I will argue that states signatory to this covenant have an extraterritorial duty to take steps towards international assistance and cooperation regarding environmental displacees, as the article includes the obligation for states to protect and respect the rights that are in this covenant within their state, but also outside of their own jurisdiction. So this is crucial in this case, because they won't have a jurisdiction anymore. They won't have a state since their islands are going to be sunk. I will argue that the concept of non-refoulement, which we've talked about in class, meaning you cannot return or expel a victim in this case, not really a victim, but sort of a victim of climate change, who has sought asylum to places where their lives or freedoms could be threatened. So that concept, I think, should be applied as an act of international cooperation towards the environmental displacees, as it is in their duty to ensure the basic protection of all human rights under the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, who's that? Yeah.
Hello, everyone. So my topic falls under the theme of this week, of course, climate refugees, obviously. And in my paper, I want to talk about climate refugees in two main parts. So first, I want to examine the issue of their definition. So my paper follows mainly the outline for today, but I submitted the outline last week, so I didn't copy the thing. But it happened to be like so resembling. So anyway, I want to first, in the first part, examine their definition and to what extent they are recognized and protected under the current framework. And the second part is more of a argumentative part, where I will see how the applicability of this issue under international law, under the different areas of international law, whether this is an issue that falls under the area of environmental law or human rights law. So we all know that refugees are people who are forced to move not legally, this is not a legal definition, but they're forced to move because of different things like persecution, like war and to escape war or a natural disaster. So, but according to the Refugee Convention that was drafted in 1951, as we saw, these people, what we want to call as climate refugees, are excluded. The thing is that, as my classmate said, the Refugee Convention was drafted in 1951, which is so back in history, if you want to call it. And back then, we didn't experience the consequences of climate change effects as we do nowadays. So the issue of climate refugees wasn't as important as it is nowadays. So there's a lot of controversy or a lot of debate around the issue of climate refugees and so to which kind of law they shall be subject. With this legal gap in defining them, this is what I want to do in my paper. I want to examine this issue more to see if we can classify them as refugees in the first place, then going to see which law, which international law applies in this area. So someone might say that since they are people who moved from their homes because of a natural disaster, for example, then they are considered refugees. But however, as I said, in the 1951 Refugee Convention, they were legally excluded in a way or another because, as we said in this convention, the victims of the natural disasters were excluded, as well as the people who move within one country. They are not mentioned there. And in mostly climate refugees, if you want to call them so, they most of the times they move within one country and not across borders. So that's how we can see them, that they are excluded from this definition. So the main argument in the first part of the paper would be that we want a new definition. Probably the second point that we had in the outline, maybe not a new convention, but a new definition, a new legal definition for them in order to know what's the legal status of these people. So a new design as a first step to integrating them in the international law framework. So the second part is, as I said, is more argumentative, giving different arguments of whether it should be under environmental law or under human rights law. People who support the first opinion of environmental law, that this is an environmental law issue, would say that as a start, the climate change issue is a scientific and environmental issue, and the adverse effects we see as floods, as desertification, as droughts, and these issues have impacts on the people and specifically on their shelters. So climate refugees is an issue that stems out of this in this context, and then we should call them as we should apply this issue under environmental law. However, we should know that more specifically what we are questioning here is that their residence is threatened. And residence is one of the main human rights that we know, that we talked about in the previous weeks. So the main argument here is that it is more of a human rights issue because it should be issue that should be considered under international law. And having seen that the circumstances of climate change mainly are affecting human rights, then it's a human rights issue and a human rights law issue. Because when we want to deal with a problem, we don't want to talk about the roots. Okay, we know that climate change is an environmental problem, but what we are seeing here, that this problem is that we are seeing consequences on the rights of humans, and therefore rendering it as a human rights issue. One of Liz's comments was that does climate change only manifest itself only in environmental disasters? Of course not, but more generally, climate change affects the world through floods, droughts, as we know, and desertification. And one another point is that regions that heavily rely on the agricultural sector for life sustenance and are the most affected. Say, for example, because of the change in the rainfall patterns, and therefore are pushed to migrate. So in this sense, displacements result not only from the fact that these people lost their residences, but also from the fact that they are losing their jobs in the agricultural sector. And if you want to put it differently, they're also losing, they also rely on their crops for food, so they consume what they grow, and therefore another human right is violated, which is the right to food, and they are pushed to migrate. So this is putting it more into a human rights law issue more than an environmental law. This is what I want to argue in this paper as the second part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I've understood correctly, you're actually addressing the last point that we discussed just in class. So these three different ways. So one, a new convention. Two,
Integrate them in the law.
yeah. So your argument is that the third way, integrating into existing law to fill the gaps, and then specific, and then using human rights. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm just
Okay.
summarizing. But I think it's interesting because it relates to this last point, these three different ways that were mentioned that we're going to discuss also next week. Thank you. Yep.
I don't know which one is mine. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So I'm also going to talk about the same topic, but in a different perspective. So I'm going to start about climate. My topic is about climate refugees and how to fill the protection gap in international law. So my research is going to assume that there should be a protection for them, and what I'm going to research is which type of framework is going to protect them more. So I'm going to analyze the pros and the cons of each type of framework to see which one will benefit them more. So I'll start that. How do I pass this? I'll start by analyzing the UN Conventions on Statelessness, and I decided to study them also because they initially didn't have any protection, and after they came after the Refugee Convention, and nowadays they also have a type, the similar type of protection than refugees. The most important part is that if they get in a country illegally, they won't be penalized, and that nowadays will happen with climate refugees. And then I'm going to analyze the legal framework for refugees, so the 1951 Convention and also its additional protocol. I'm going to analyze this to see if climate refugees should come in the additional protocol, because the 1967 protocol, it existed so it could include other perspective of refugees that didn't exist in the 1951. So maybe it's time to have another additional protocol to include this new category. Then the problems start, because I think it's really difficult to make difference between climate refugees and environmental refugees. I'm not discussing the terms because I don't even know if they are correct, but when we see practical cases, it's difficult. So we know that climate refugees are people that suffered impacts from climate disasters, and environmental refugees who suffered from natural disasters. So then we have like an earthquake, like what happened in Haiti. Scientists say that it was a natural disaster, but we don't know if in the future it's going to say that also climate change can cause that. So that's why it's difficult. And also when we talk about desertification, pollution, we don't know exactly if that's climate change that's causing or if it's only from the environmental natural disasters. And also the difference, even if we can get a group of climate refugees and another of environmental refugees. In these groups, there are a lot of difference. For example, in the group of climate refugees, someone that comes from a sinking island, he's never gonna have the chance to come back to his country. So that is a permanent effect. As someone that suffered desertification, we don't know, but maybe in the future he'll have a chance to come back, and so maybe he needs only a temporary protection. Finally, I'm going to look at the legal protection possibilities. When I did my outline, I thought that I was gonna look at them and then think which one was better. But after starting my paper this week, I'm pretty sure that my opinion is that the best option we have is to create a climate change, a climate refugee convention. And that's because what I'm going to argument, and I really believe that, is that we shouldn't put them in additional protocol in the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement is happening now, and if they didn't include them, they won't do it now. Also, in the 1951 Refugee Convention as additional protocol, I think that will weaken the status of refugee, and the biggest organization that protects refugees, that is the UNHCR, they are against that. So I think we should trust them, and also have a more progressive interpretation of existing frameworks. I also don't think that with this type of solution, we're going to enforce states to receive these type of refugees. So I really believe that we should create a new convention for them, because it has specific characteristics, and it's a really broad group, and we need to, in this convention, put all the differences that are between them, know if we want to put in the same convention people that suffer from disasters, from climate change, and also, the biggest difference that I see is that in the case of refugees, states receive them as a humanitarian cause. As with climate change, I think that they have much more obligation since they're causing it. So even to enforce states their responsibilities, we can also do that with this convention. Like, if a state is causing more climate change, it deserves to receive more refugees caused by that. So I think that in this convention, this subject can be studied in more details. That's thank you.
Thank you.
So what I think is really clear is that you can study the same topic, but of course every paper is going to be completely different. So I do get questions sometimes from students say, oh, has somebody else also chosen this topic? Even if all of you write about the same topic, your argument is going to be different, and the point that you make in your essay is going to be different. Thank you very much. So we have Lena. Sorry, I should have said that Robert has been moved to another week, so I should have told you, but yeah.
Okay, so I'm not gonna present you a topic on migration, but I'm writing on the participation of indigenous peoples in the Paris Agreement. And the main objective of my essay is to analyze whether the Paris Agreement has ensured the right to participation in decision-making of indigenous people from the Andean region. And I will limit my analysis to peoples from the Andean region, because I think indigenous peoples are a very heterogeneous group, and they have different priorities in the fight against climate change, and it will be very difficult to analyze their general participation in the Paris Agreement. So my current hypothesis is that the physical representation of indigenous peoples from the Andean region in Paris has been actually higher than in former negotiation processes, such as for the Kyoto Protocol. But I think that the substantive participation, so the actual influence which the peoples had on the final treaty text, was still relatively limited. And I will show that and this is shown by the fact that the final treaty text reflects the concept of buen vivir only in very few aspects. And so what do I mean when I say buen vivir? So buen vivir is often described as a specific indigenous way of life, a lifestyle of indigenous peoples from the Andean region, which aims at a society in unity with nature. And it's also sometimes described as an indigenous alternative to the Western and Eurocentric concept of development. So in order to analyze, in order to answer the question whether the Paris Agreement has ensured the right to participation of indigenous peoples, I will have based my analysis on two subordinate research questions. And one is how indigenous peoples from the Andean region were represented at the negotiations in Paris. And then the second one is how the concept of buen vivir is reflected in the final treaty text. And these two questions already show the structure of my analysis and also the methodology, because the first question addresses the procedural part of the right to participation, so how indigenous peoples were represented in Paris. And I will analyze this by drawing on a model from a political scientist who's called Anna Pitkin, who has established 4 different types of representation: the formalistic, descriptive, symbolic, and substantive representation. And my second subordinate research question addresses the substantive part of the right to participation, which is actually the influence which indigenous peoples had on the final treaty text. And I will analyze this through a comparative analysis of the treaty text and the concept of buen vivir. And the main sources which I'm using for my analysis are relatively diverse, and they include primary legal sources and secondary academic literature, but also reports from NGOs and international organizations. And I'm also trying to do an interview with a representative of an NGO working on indigenous rights. So the final question which needs to be answered is, why is this topic relevant? So why is it relevant to write about it? And I found 2 main answers for this. The first one is that there are a lot of scientific reports which say that actually indigenous peoples are highly impacted by climate change. And as a consequence of this, a lot of indigenous peoples have actually tried to participate in international negotiations on climate change. And the United Nations Declarations on Indigenous People Rights says in Article 18 that indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their right. So since there are reports which say that climate change is actually affecting the rights of indigenous people, I think a quite logical conclusion is that they should also have the right to participate in negotiations on climate change. So this was kind of the first reason, and then the second reason why this topic is relevant addresses more the internal coherence of the Paris Agreement, because Article 7.5 of the agreement says that countries shall be guided by the knowledge of indigenous peoples when developing adaptation policies. And also the preamble states that states should respect, promote, and consider indigenous people rights in their action against climate change. So I'm trying to analyze whether the Paris Agreement is coherent with what it demands and what it has been done. So whether it itself has actually ensured the aspects which it is demanding from the states. So whether it has also included the knowledge of indigenous people in the text. Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lena. And I think some of the things that you mentioned in your presentation, I think are very good for everyone to think about. Also, even though you don't have to include in your presentation a sort of justification or an explanation of which sources you're using, but it is very good to be very aware of the kinds of what literature you're relying on, because it does have an impact on the kind of argument that you make. So do keep that in mind. I have a few minutes. So regarding the essay topics, what is the most important thing for you to do is to really keep trying to come up with your central argument. So what is your central argument? And it's not something that you're going to know immediately, which is why also I think, and I hope that this process of sort of talking about your topic and writing an outline and then presenting it will help for you also to formulate, okay, this is the main point. Because what you will see, and I'm sure you've already noticed this, in whatever topic you choose, they're huge topics and huge issues, and you can go on for a really long time writing about these, whatever issue it is that you've chosen. But the point of the exercise is not for you to write everything that you can find about a certain topic, but to make an argument, which of course you won't know what your argument is immediately. So you have to go through the process of reading things and then but at some point, before you write your final essay and submit it, you have to know what is it that I want to say. And another thing I wanted to really make clear is don't be afraid to make your argument. So you don't have to necessarily still agree with the argument that you've made, 1 year from now. So don't worry if you're making an argument that you think, okay, I'm not sure that I would still be making this argument, but you do have to make an argument, because the danger otherwise is that you stay in this, I'm just going to just give an overview, rather than saying, this is what I think. So if you write a paper, for example, saying, I think that the way to deal with climate refugees is to come up with a new convention, if then, if you continue researching this topic and a few years from now you think maybe that wasn't such a good idea, that's absolutely fine. So don't worry about that. Next, yes, a few things about next week's class. I think you have all received the email also that our class next week is also in another room. I'll put that on Moodle also to make sure that everybody knows. So it's in room A2, which is right next door here. It's also kind of a lecture theater, but it's a bit smaller. So at least we got used to the setting for now, and then we'll be back in our regular room the week after. Next week we'll be discussing statehood. So what happens when a small island developing state loses its land, and what happens to the legal definition of that state, and what happens to the citizens, which is an important question in international law. So that is it, and I will see you all next week.